NXT has given us a lot of great stuff over the years, whether that be the initial rise of Sami Zayn, the Gargano-Ciampa feud, or even the emergence of newer stars like Trick Williams and Braun Breaker in recent years. Hell, there's a reason why there was a period during the mid to late 2010s where the black and gold brand was many fans' favorite to watch. But not everything NXT has done has been great. No, like with every brand, they've had their fair share of flops. But what were the biggest failures of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with scripts? Yes, we all still remember this one. After all, it's pretty much gone down in WWE infamy now as being one of the all-time bad gimmicks, right up there alongside Retribution, Mantar, and the Gobbledygooker. And what makes this one all the worse is that it happened so recently, as it was in 2022 that mysterious vignettes began appearing on WWE TV, teasing the arrival of a new masked superstar. Immediately then, fans began speculating about who this masked star might be. Was it El Hijo del Vikingo? Was it someone like Rey Fénix or Penta El Cero Miedo? Well, the answer to that question was none of them. Rather, it was Reggie, the former sommelier for Carmella, wearing a bad Halloween mask. Needless to say then, what followed was bad. Not because Reggie didn't have a certain flair to him, what with him being very skilled in the ways of Cirque du Soleil and all, but because it was simply impossible to take this new character seriously. Come on now, just take one look at that ring gear and tell us it's not a Wish.com version of the Power Rangers. Even The Rock would have struggled to get this one over. And so it was, as the weeks and months went on, scripts very quickly turned into something of a punchline amongst NXT fans, and a physical representation of everything that was wrong with the early days of the 2.0 era. It didn't matter if he was picking up wins over the likes of Ika Menjiro, Quincy Elliott, or Dabba-Kato. No one was behind this masked superstar, as all they could think about when they looked at him was how close his mask looked to be falling off his head at any given time. So maybe that's why by May of 2023 then, realizing the whole thing was failing, WWE attempted to rectify things by taking the mask off of scripts and letting him at least regain some sense of dignity. But while this did serve him better, by then the damage had been done, and so it was that come June of the following year, the Memphis native would part ways with the company once his contract ran out. Still, at least Reggie can take some solace in the fact that he wasn't the only one saddled with a pretty terrible gimmick around this time, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, Wendy Chu, and her babyface sleeping character. Yes, NXT's booking team at the time took one look at Karen Q, one of the top indie stars on the North American women's wrestling scene during the late 2010s, and decided what she needed was to be repacked as a character who did nothing but sleep. And it's not as if the New York native was new to WWE by then either, because she's been working for them since 2018, mostly under the gimmick of Mei Ying. But presumably feeling she needed to be more entertaining, the decision was made in 2021 to change up her character entirely, with her at this point going from being a mystical killer to a 20-something who liked to come down to the ring in pajamas and take a nap mid-match. Yes, this gimmick would have even been considered silly during the New Generation era. Still, with this being NXT 2.0, it was deemed to be exactly what the brand needed then, and so it continued on for 2 full years, during which time Chu got a chance to mix it up with the likes of Tiffany Stratton, Mandy Rose, and Io Shirai in bouts which gave her nothing to work with on account of the absolute death knell of a character she had. The only saving grace about the whole thing at all, in fact, is that, since returning from an injury in June of 2024, the New Yorker has been able to change things up a little bit, so that even if she is still playing the sleepy girl in pajamas, at least she's now took on the role of a heel with a slightly altered image, with this giving her something to build upon. Will she be able to make this work? That remains to be seen. But given the talent she has, we have high hopes that she's able to make something out of it, and maybe even go on to have some main roster success if all goes well. Even if she's not able to do this though, at least she can always rest safe in the knowledge that even at her worst, Wendy Chu was never as maligned by fans as our next subject, Eva Marie. Now, during her early days in WWE during the Divas era of the early 2010s, Eva Marie felt like a much better fit for the company, as she was more suited to the division at that time, as in-ring skill wasn't considered to be as important back then. And so, during this time period then, she was able to find a fair bit of success, even if she wasn't always what you'd consider a fan favorite. Of course, this all changed around the mid-2010s, however, as it was then that a major sea change had taken place within the women's division, with this being around about the time the Four Horsewomen had risen to prominence and women's wrestling had started getting treated seriously for the first time in a long time. So now, rather than feeling like she fit right in with the NXT roster of the time, Eva Marie felt like a relic of the past. And for that reason, whenever she came out on TV, fans rejected her loudly, as they feared her run represented two steps back for the promotion, especially as at one point, it really did feel like she was going to win the NXT Women's title. Thankfully though, she wouldn't do this, but that didn't mean her whole spell in developmental during the mid-2010s didn't do more harm than good anyway, as even if she wasn't the champion, she was still regularly taking TV time away from others. Sure, this would have been okay had she improved much in the ring, but this was never exactly Eva Marie's forte. No, whenever she mixed it up with the likes of Carmella, Billie Kay, or Liv Morgan, it never quite clicked. Even Bayley didn't get a good match out of her when the two met on the November 18th, 2015 episode of NXT. And when someone as good as the role model can't do anything with you, you know you're in trouble. So perhaps it's for the best that come the spring of 2016, the Walnut Creek native would be moved up to Raw, allowing NXT to go back to doing what it did best, and that was focus on the best in-ring performers North America had to offer at that time. Of course, NXT's goal wasn't always to act as a super indie though. No, back during its early days, it was more of a game show, and the bad quality of this game show format was rarely made clearer than during the infamous Season 2 of the whole thing. Why Season 2? Well, while Season 1 was bad, it did at the very least give WWE fans their first taste of wrestlers such as Wade Barrett, Heath Slater, and Daniel Bryan. And anything that started the American Dragon on his path towards winning the WWE title at WrestleMania 30 can't be all bad. For the second season, though, there were no such highlights. As while Husky Harris would appear here, this gimmick was completely unrecognizable from what Bray Wyatt would later become. And then there was Kaval, someone who, if rumors are to be believed, was always going to struggle to make it big in WWE on account of his explosive temperament. That said, now that they had given him a chance, the way to get low-key over most certainly wouldn't have been to have him do challenges which did nothing to highlight his talents. And there's also the fact that it gave us the infamous Genesis of McGillicuddy promo. Yes, it was during a promo challenge on an episode of this season that Michael McGillicuddy dropped the ball so badly he still hasn't lived it down to this day. Honestly, outside of the fact that Husky Harris eventually went on to greater things, we struggle to think of much positive to say about this one, the same of which can be said about the season which came after it, Season 3, that being the all-women's series. That's right, we're doubling down on the game show era of NXT because for as bad as Season 2 was, at least it was treated with some degree of seriousness by the company. When it came to Season 3, however, this one was never given any credibility from the start. And this was partly because at the time, women's wrestling just wasn't taken seriously. So this is why, while the likes of AJ Lee, Caitlyn, and Naomi were doing everything they could to stand out and be noticed throughout the tournament, they'd regularly find themselves playing second fiddle to things like the commentary team amusing themselves with unrelated banter. And even when commentary was focused on the women, the terrible tasks they were being asked to do didn't exactly make them look good. No one came out of this one looking like a star. Hell, it would take a few years of hard work after the fact for any of the ladies of NXT Season 3 to recover and shake off the stink of it. Just imagine how good this one could have been, considering the talent that was involved. In 2010, though, that wasn't the case. And so, such a thing was never going to happen. And it would also mark the beginning of the end for NXT and its game show format as a whole in many ways, because while there would be a Season 4 and a Season 5 which followed, neither of those had the same level of interest as the first 3 seasons had. Yes, rather than make stars out of AJ Lee and Naomi on day 1, Vince McMahon effectively killed the territory here, forcing him to rebuild it again from the ground up. But as we've seen already, even the glory days of the black and gold brand wasn't without its failings. And another one of its failings is our next subject, the empty arena era of the show. Now, we know this could apply to every wrestling company during 2020 and the first half of 2021, as whether it was the Thunderdome, Daly's Place, or anywhere else, lockdown wrestling was pretty hard to watch for the most part. That said, while WWE's main roster had their moments, especially during their cinematic matches, NXT really got hit hard by the removal of fans from arenas, as it was a kill shot to the show, which came at the worst possible time. After all, by the time 2020 came around, the black and gold brand was already starting to falter in popularity and was past its peak years of the mid to late 2010s. Obviously then, once fans were taken out of the equation and NXT was relegated to filming shows exclusively in the Performance Center with zero atmosphere to help them get by, it only served to speed up the demise of the once mighty brand, as week in and week out, the show fell to increasingly low levels. Sure, there were a few bright spots of the empty arena era of the developmental brand, such as Finn Balor's great series against Kyle O'Reilly or Io Shirai's world title run. But on the whole, it had never felt less important to tune in and find out what was happening on Triple H's show. And so perhaps it should come as no surprise then that by the time this era ended and fans were allowed back in attendance, NXT had been forced to rebrand into its 2.0 incarnation, with many fans not enjoying this new version, at least during its early days. Still, NXT 2.0 can't take the blame for our next subject, as that came a few years prior. What are we talking about here? Why, the sad story of the Forgotten Sons, of course. Now, you could argue this one was set up for failure right from the get-go, as the whole gimmick of the stable made up of Wesley Blake, Steve Cutler, and Jackson Riker was that they were considered so unimportant in the hierarchy of WWE, pretty much everyone had forgotten who they were. So when they were put together then, it wasn't exactly as if any one of them boosted the other's star power. And it wasn't like fans were any more interested in watching them as a result. Still, that didn't stop Triple H from trying to push the trio as a legitimate threat from 2018 onwards on the black and gold brand, with this being the point they picked up a number of notable wins, including one in which two of their members, Blake and Cutler, made it all the way to the finals of the 2019 Dusty Rhodes Classic. Sadly though, the Forgotten Sons would ultimately lose in the finals to Aleister Black and Ricochet, and after that, their slide down into irrelevance would be swift, as they did precisely nothing else of note, with them getting knocked out in the first round once the time came for the 2020 Dusty Rhodes Classic. Yes, this really was a failure on pretty much all levels for the developmental brand, as it did nothing to enhance any of the men involved. Rather, it just made them look worse than they had done when they'd started. And this was why it felt so curious that WWE decided to move the whole act up to the main roster in the spring of 2020. That said, for as big of a disaster as the Forgotten Sons act was, at least they made it to TV at all, the same of which could not be said for our next subject, Josh Brle. Who was Josh Brle? Well, if you were watching Tough Enough Season 6 in 2015, then you'd remember him as one of the winners of that show, with this meaning he'd be given a WWE contract immediately thereafter and shipped off to the Performance Center ahead of a presumed NXT debut. Except Josh Brle never actually made his televised NXT debut. No, after a few appearances at live events in Florida during late 2015 and early 2016, where he went by the name of Bronson Matthews, the Tough Enough winner would be cut from his contract altogether. What was the reason for this? Was he not cutting it in the ring? Not exactly. No, the real problem for the Colorado native appeared to be his attitude towards other wrestlers on the roster, with this causing issues for him when in January of 2016, he made an online post referring to the social outcasts as the social jobbers. So because he'd just insulted four of his co-workers, despite still being in the stage of his job where he should have been trying to ingratiate himself to the locker room, Brle would not only be called out by main roster stars like Kevin Owens and Cody Rhodes, but he'd also be temporarily banned from the NXT locker room. Yeah, it turns out it's best not to talk trash about your co-workers, especially if those guys were Bo Dallas, Heath Slater, Curtis Axel, and Adam Rose, four of the most liked people on the WWE roster at the time. And this was a lesson the rookie would be forced to learn the hard way, as after he made such a mistake, his career was all but done, with things becoming official in November of 2016 when he was formally released from his contract. Could Josh Brle have been more? Maybe, but then it's impossible to say, as he'd never even appeared on NXT TV, so all we've got to go on is how he was on Tough Enough. And as we all know from NXT seasons 1 through 5, a game show format is hardly the best way to judge whether or not someone is going to be a good wrestler. But then maybe it's for the best that he didn't make it to TV, because had he done so, there's every chance he could have ended up with a character as questionable as our next subject, Boa. Okay, this one is one which actually ties back to a prior entry in today's video, as the Boa gimmick was directly linked to one of Wendy Chu's earlier incarnations, Mei Ying. That's right, it all really got going in 2020, as that was the point where Yanbo Wang, the man behind the gimmick, started appearing on episodes of NXT giving letters to Xia Li, letters which appeared to have been written by some mysterious higher power. But that higher power wasn't Vince McMahon this time. No, it was actually the aforementioned Mei Ying. And as the weeks went on and both Lee and Boa started failing to carry out the tasks which had been set out for them, Ying made sure they were punished for their sins in the most cartoonish way imaginable. Yes, what fans witnessed at this point was less Martin Scorsese cinema and more like a bad version of a B-movie. And it only got worse over the weeks which followed, as that was when Boa started getting possessed by a spirit named Qian Sha, a spirit which seemed to imbue him with the special power of doing jobs to a pre-main roster Solo Sikoa. Obviously then, this did nothing to help his career or entertain fans. So it's no surprise that his whole allegiance to Mei Ying and Xia Li would be dropped soon after, as he instead started teasing a team-up with Dante Chen. And so it was then that on May 3rd of 2024, Boa would officially be released from his contract, with this meaning his pretty horrible gimmick would go no further from there, as he'd instead return to his native Beijing. But let's move away from individual characters for now and back over to show concepts, as it's there where we find our next subject, the utter abject failure that was NXT Kids. Now, to be fair, we can see what WWE was trying to do here. After all, the company has always been a more child-targeted product for the most part outside of the Attitude Era. So for them to attempt to create a whole show specifically for young children in August of 2015 then, well, that made all the sense in the world. The only problem was the show they put on here was pretty bad. So bad it would be dropped after one single pilot episode was filmed. What was on that pilot episode? Well, in the first of two matches, we'd see Bayley go one-on-one with Billie Kay. And the tone would be set early here, as Michael Cole, Corey Graves, and their two elementary school-age color commentators immediately started talking about how the Australian-born Kay was a kangaroo lady. Still, at least it had to get better from there, right? No such luck, unfortunately, as after what seemed like an age of more bad Aussie jokes, the second bout of the show saw Kalisto take on Ty Dillinger. That's right, it looked like this one was going to consist mainly of matches between lower mid-card talents and not too much else. So maybe it's for the best then that this one never made it past the pilot stage, as for as bad as it was, we at least get to look back on it now as a fun piece of wrestling lore. But what about our next subject? That being the NXT Women's Tag Team title. That's right, after being introduced in March of 2021, and being first won in a tournament by Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez, the belts didn't last very long. Yes, with only 11 reigns in total, the titles didn't get much of a lineage, as they were never really given much of an important role on the show. In fact, the only real memorable title reign of note was the one when the belts were held by Gigi Dolan and JC Jane of Toxic Attraction, with this reign completing the faction's quest to secure all the gold, as Mandy Rose was the reigning NXT Women's Champion. Outside of this, however, most reigns with these belts were largely forgettable, with the likes of Io Shirai and Zoe Stark holding them, as well as Ember Moon and Shotzi Blackheart. Even when Cora Jade and Roxanne Perez won the straps in 2022, Cora would end up turning heel on her partner and throw her belt in the trash, with this being a bad sign for the future of those titles. And so it was then that by the time the final title holders, the unholy union of Alba Fire and Isla Dawn, got a hold of the belts, they unified them with the main roster women's tag titles, with the NXT version being officially retired as of June 23rd, 2023. Yes, it was a sad end for the lineage of the belts, as they never really had much of a chance after only being around for a couple of years. But as we've seen today, for as great as NXT is, there was never any shortage of bad things it produced that we had to watch while we waited for the next great angle to come along and take the bad taste away.